Cheers. Good morning. I thought on this morning of September 1st, 2020, I would recall a major event of Wednesday, September 1st, 1920, and that is the declaration of the establishment of the modern state of Lebanon, Greater Lebanon, as it was called at that time. But before doing that, I'd like to perhaps review very briefly a couple of events in the run-up to that famous declaration, and speak a little bit actually about Levantinism, the age of Levantinism, as I was reminded by a dear friend and mentor in a long Twitter thread on the topic a couple of days ago. Now, 19th century in the Eastern Mediterranean had been an age of Levantinism, what many scholars have defined it thusly, and I think it was Philip Mansell, perhaps, who coined that phrase, the age of Levantinism. And so from Alexandria, going through the port cities of Haifa, Beirut, Tripoli, to Salonika, a Levantine kind of civilization of mercantile and cultural exchanges spanning multiple languages and multiple traditions was emerging and taking hold. And in time, it began dominating and shaping a distinct conception of this sort of multifarious, multichromatic identity, a heterogeneous, pantheistic parameter of identity that can be best described as Levantine ecumenism. And early to mid 20th century Egyptian Jewish writer Jacqueline Kahanoff described this Levantine ecumenism as a space where, quote, where Jews, Muslims, Christians, Greeks, Italians, Syrians, Arabs, and others had lived together in peace, and if not in peace and harmony, then at least lived side by side in acknowledgement of each other's distinctive character. I believed, she wrote, that it was only natural for people to understand each other, even though they spoke different languages, for them to have different names, Greek names, Muslim names, Syrian, Jewish, Christian, Arab, Italian, Tunisian, Armenian, and at the same time to be able to be similar to each other. And understand each other's cultural rituals, end quote. Now, interestingly, for the Anglophones here, French was the lingua franca of this sort of cultural hybridity and fluidity. It stood in stark contrast to the monoculturalism taking place and taking shape elsewhere, namely in the European provinces of the Ottoman Empire, and later with Arab nationalism. Arab nationalism would come, and it was sort of the monochromatic conception of identity that Arab nationalism advanced would come to liquidate this age of Levantinism, or this age of Levantine ecumenism. The Levantines' lodestar had been the Mediterranean continent and the lands beyond it. And the term Mediterranean continent is actually a coinage of French historian of the Mediterranean, Fernand Braudel, to whom the Levantinists were very sensitive. Michel Chiha, for instance, of Lebanon, was part of that universe before kind of concocting this idea of the merchant republic, if you will, which in 1943 gave birth to that wretched national pact. So this emerged from the fact that the Ottoman administration provided no parameters for citizenship, for membership, if you will, in the empire, beyond this polyglot, multicultural, not citizenry. it relates to subjects of the Ottoman Empire more so than citizens. There was no sense of citizenship at the time. And so, save for a few intellectuals familiar with emerging European notions and conceptions of nationalism as a monocultural kind of parameter of identity, there was no distinct Arab identity or political personality outside of the Ottoman Muslim versus non-Muslim space that the empire provided. Even those who advocated for Arabness, they were actually speaking of a localism. They were speaking a local political language, arguing for a Syrian identity, which was itself still inchoate at the time and certainly not defined in Arab terms as such. In Mount Lebanon during that time period, there was a writing, versification, intellectual production in favor of a Lebanese specificity, reclaiming a Lebanese identity, reclaiming the Imara days and reclaiming the Phoenician progenitors. But at least until 1920, the Levantine cultural model dominated and was defined by an undetermined, chameleon-like ethnic, cultural, and linguistic hybridity. Again, as I mentioned earlier, French was the common language of this multifarious ecumenical culture. Metropolitan France itself spoke of French Levantinism, or Levantine Frenchness, if you will, which had a great appeal in the Levant. Britain, on the other hand, denigrated this form of aberrant, or what Britain considered an aberrant hybridity, and favored instead an uppity kind of British type of purity. Hybridity was bad in the UK, especially in the late Victorian era, which saw the beginning of the emergence of, or the attraction of national ideas. Nobility and freedom were, in that sense, the distinguishing features of pure cultures, Teutonic, Anglo-Saxon, etc., which viewed with a great deal of contempt the mixity of the Latin Europeans, the French mainly, and their Levantine Catholic protégés. The Levantines' predilection for mixity and the French language, on top of that, made them, in the eyes of the British, decrepit, inauthentic, soft, and effeminate. And that is a term actually that you still encounter in today's Lebanon, modern Lebanon, sort of, the dichotomy between the French-educated Lebanese and the British or the English-educated or Anglophone Lebanese and Francophone Lebanese. The Anglophones tend to look with a great deal of disdain at French-speaking Lebanese, and they consider, the French language an effeminate language. In any case, the fact that the overwhelming majority of those Francophone Levantinists were non-Protestants, in the main Catholics, did not help them. And actually, British historian who is originally a Levantine, Albert Hourani, an eminent historian of the Middle East, wrote thusly about being a Levantine, and I think this, encapsulates the British attitude towards this mixity, this hybridity, this multiplicity of languages and cultures, etc. So Hourani writes, being a Levantine is to live in two worlds or more at once, without belonging to either. It is to be able to go through all the external forms which indicate the possession of a certain nationality, religion, or culture without actually possessing any. It is no longer to have one standard of values of one's own. It is to not be able to create, but only to imitate, and so not even to imitate correctly, since that also requires a certain level of originality. Ouch. Being a Levantine, he concluded, is to belong to no community and to possess nothing of one's own. Being a Levantine reveals itself in lostness, pretentiousness, cynicism, and despair. And culture. Non-culture, I'm sorry. Ending the quote. But the Levantines themselves took great pride in this hybridity, right? And the fact that those Levantines were in the majority non-Protestants, in the main Catholics, did not help them in the eyes of Hourani and the culture that he represented, British perception of identity. The fact that they spoke French was certainly their bane. Still, a variety of national ideas began getting traction in the Near East of the early 20th century, and they would begin finding a political expression in the 1920s. In Lebanon, one dominant such current was termed Phoenicianism, was spearheaded mainly by Uniate Christians, and argued essentially for a specific Lebanese identity, the progenitors of which harked back to the famed Canaanite mariners of classical antiquity, whose original homeland was Lebanon. Now, the providential moment for those young Phoenicians was October 8th, 1918, marking the date of the Ottomans' surrender at the close of the Great War and the landing of the first French contingents in Beirut, sort of a reminder of what had happened 50 years earlier with the landing of a French contingent in 1860 at the same Beirut harbor. Now, the young Phoenicians' emotions were overwhelming at this particular moment in time. At the sight of the first French vessel docking at the Beirut harbor, the feeling was a sort of a God sent, a savior arriving, a clue that salvation was at hand. One witness wrote at the time how he had spent an overnight on the day before racing down the mountain on foot in the direction of Beirut. Once he saw those ships arriving to port. Once arrived in Beirut, he said, upon himself descending the mountains, trembling with emotion, he jumped aboard the first French vessel that he was able to board and proceeded to, quote, this is his direct quote, he proceeded to hug and kiss those beloved uniformed strangers, dearer to my heart than my own mother and father, end quote. Now, prior to that, he said he'd been a draft dodger. He'd been dreading the shame of having to don Ottoman regimentals, and so he became a deserter, taking refuge in Mount Lebanon, and he would spend 4 years atop his mountain perch, or his mountain sanctuary, or his mountain refuge, if you will, running away from the Ottomans. And so he worked the land and skirted famine at time, and awaited the arrival of salvation. So as the first French detachments made land in Beirut, this same observer mentions how he stood on one street corner in one of the city's major thoroughfares. And that I don't know where exactly that street corner was, but I imagine it must have been Jemaise, because he mentions the nearby Café des Glaces. The text is written in French. So the Café des Glaces is Ahwit L'Aziz, and I think there was one in Jemaise, unless there's another location. Any of you who know the Beirut of the times could please chime in. But he stood there almost hiding, watching, and feverishly jotting down the moment's emotions. And he writes, quote, column after column of soldiers marching in formation. Suddenly a small battalion of the French cavalry emerges, with riders rearing their horses, their bravery barely contained, throbbing with audacity and manly valor. They had fire in the belly. They breathed fire into the cheering crowds. By God, those were the long-awaited saviors, our much-needed protector gods. The entire crowd of spectators quivered, I felt my own legs buckling from underneath me. My voice was growing fainter, choked with emotion, as if something passionate, moving, loving was grasping at my breast, embracing me, snuggling me, cuddling with me, keeping me safe, keeping me alive. End quote. You'll have to keep in mind, and I mentioned this in an earlier recording, that this is coming on the heels of the Great Famine, which had devastated, annihilated more than one half of Ottoman Mount Lebanon's population. And that is why what would happen subsequently, culminating in what would happen on September 1st, 1920, was an existential necessity to the Lebanese, in the main to those Lebanese that the young Phoenicians represented. In one personal recollection of September 1st, 1920, one young Phoenician made sure to bear witness to the devastation that preceded this moment of liberation, this moment of salvation. And so he wrote of 1916, 1918, I saw, quote, I saw firsthand the famished chew on decaying cadavers in Beirut. I saw firsthand the famished chew on decaying cadavers in Beirut. I witnessed firsthand an octogenarian burying with his own two hands the emaciated body of a grandchild. I have seen with my very own two eyes the municipal garbage wagon right here in Beirut piling up atop heaps of rubbish the dead children of the assassinated mountain, strewn about on city sidewalks, dumping them in freshly dug up mass graves, human trenches from which emanated the abominable, desperate cries of those who had not yet been drowned by death. One wonders what the burden would have been for a Lady Macbeth before such an ocean of blood and mud and utter devastation. End quote. And so this backdrop had been fundamental, had been foundational to what comes next on the morning of September 1st, 1920. But again, as I've mentioned in multiple places before, the French were not keen on the idea of Greater Lebanon. And neither were a big chunk of the Lebanese population and also a not insignificant wing of the young Phoenicians. Not very keen on the idea of Greater Lebanon. But in an age long before airports and telecommunication, the Greater Lebanon young Phoenicians insisted on Greater Lebanon. They insisted on the Beirut harbor and other coastal towns, in addition to the Bekaa Valley. But even with those restituted territories, not added territories, because the language is very specific, even with those restituted territories, the young Phoenicians, and namely the Grand Liban Maronites among them, still thought that Grand Liban was actually a concession, not an overreach, as this history is being written today as something that should not have happened, that Greater Lebanon was unnatural, was a colonial construct. In the eyes of the young Phoenicians, Grand Liban was actually small. And therefore, it was a concession because what they had in mind, the Lebanon in its natural historical frontiers, was much larger than the current today's Lebanese Republic. But of course, from today's purview, this concession was both a political blunder and a demographic time bomb. Still, brimming with hubris and renewed national energy, the young Phoenicians believed that over time they would Lebanonize the Muslim components of the new state, but also the Muslim component at the same time had a plan of their own, one that saw them over time getting the Maronites themselves to get in touch with their Arabness and therefore end up forgetting about or relinquishing this idea of a distinct Lebanese entity. wishful thinking, perhaps silly hubris on both sides, but those were the overriding sentiments at the time. And there was no stopping the Maronites and their Christian allies forging ahead, putting in place a state in their own image. And so on a Wednesday morning, not very much unlike this morning, 100 years ago, on September 1st, 1920, General Henri Gouraud, the High Commissioner of the French Republic and governor of the League of Nations mandated territories of a Levant recently wrested from a defeated Ottoman Empire, would bring into being a modern Lebanese republic intended and expressly designed as a confederation of communities. Greater Lebanese began Gouraud's solemn act of state creation. Grand Libanais, I assured you, and I'm going to read you, this is perhaps the most precise translation of the original French and the most complete part of the text. I'm sure you've encountered many snippets of this text anthologized in many different places, but not in the complete form that I'm reproducing here. So, Greater Lebanese, I assured you a few weeks ago at a crucial time in your history that the day was near that your ancestors had in vain hoped for, and that you, more fortunate than they, will no doubt be seeing shining through. Well, that day is now upon us. And so before all the people gathered here, peoples of all regions, once dominated by Mount Lebanon, peoples who had once lived as neighbors, and who shall from this day forward be united under the auspices of a single nation, rooted in its past, eminent in its future. In the presence of the Lebanese authorities, children of the country's most venerable families, representatives of all faiths and all rites and all confessions and all communities, among whom, and pay attention to this, and among whom I must greet with special veneration the great patriarch of Lebanon. He doesn't say the patriarch of the Maronites. He doesn't say the Maronite patriarch. He stopped short of saying the glory of Lebanon was given him. Still, he says, I must greet with special veneration. Among all of these venerable people present, I must greet with special veneration the great patriarch of Lebanon, who has descended from his mountain sanctuary to celebrate this most glorious of days, crowning his life's struggles and achievements. At the foot of these majestic mountains, which in prevailing as the impregnable bulwark of your country's faith and freedom, have shaped your nation's strength, on the shores of this mythical sea, which has been witness to the triremes of Phoenicia. Triremes, this is a Phoenician contribution to maritime travel, right? The triremes of Phoenicia, these are the ships that had 3 rows of rowers, a very slick, fast ship. So, which in prevailing the majestic mountains, etc., which is in prevailing as the impregnable bulwark of your country's faith and freedom, have shaped your nation's strength on the shores of this mythical sea, which has been witness to the trireme, the fleets of Phoenicia, Greece, and Rome, and which once carried across the universe your subtle, skillful, and eloquent forefathers. Today, the same sea is joyfully bringing you confirmation of a great and old friendship and the good fortune of French peace. Before all of these witnesses to your aspirations, your struggles, and your history, and in sharing your pride, I solemnly proclaim Greater Lebanon. And in the name of the French Republic, I salute her in her grandeur and in her power. It is in this Lebanon, with its mountain, that the ardent heart of this nation beats. Behold this beautiful country arising, free, breaking away from the heavy hands that have for centuries tried to stifle it. This country will finally be able to employ for its own development the character and skill that you and your ancestors have often, way too often, deployed and expended abroad. You are now free to put your skills to the service of your nation. Try to reread this, try to listen to it, try to let it imbue your very being with today's happenings as a background. Behold, Greater Lebanon, he says, Greater Lebanese, behold the sacred lot of hopes and sacrifices that the solemn moment carries with it. And so I shall be a traitor to the trust that you have put in me, and of which I am infinitely proud, should I fail to remind you that it is incumbent upon a free nation, wishing to become a great nation, to fulfill a sacred national duty. The first among your national duties, nay, the most sacred of them all, is union. It is union that shall define your greatness, just like your past ethno-religious rivalries had defined your weaknesses. Greater Lebanon, pay attention to this, Greater Lebanon was conceived to benefit everyone and is in place, or is being put in place, to harm and disadvantage absolutely no one. I messed this up, let me repeat it. Greater Lebanon was conceived to benefit everyone and is in place to harm and disadvantage absolutely no one. And so, saluting both our brotherly national flags, allow me to join my voice to your own, loudly shouting out with you, long live Greater Lebanon, long live France. And so there you have it. 100 years after its rebirth as a modern republic, Lebanon is at a new crossroads. A union intended as a federation, faced with the prospects of either implementing its formative federative foundations of 100 years ago, under, hopefully what will come now, will be under a protected new international regime, face that, or face a cluster of rump states, each going its own separate way. And so, with that, happy birthday, Greater Lebanon. 100 years is impressive. عقبال المية الجايين.